So following on with another audio talk was a good theme. This is, one moment. Hold that thought about, no worries. Just contain your excitement. We're just going to wait a little bit longer. It's going to make for a very good talk. That's much better. Excellent. All right. So now we have Marie Havemann. Apologies if my Australian accent ruins everybody's names. From Sandbox Interactive, also to talk to you about audio, this time the budget of the entire audio experience. Be very interesting to learn about, so take it away.
Thank you. All right, hello and welcome to the session about budgeting audio for your game. This topic is something that a lot of people struggle with, so I was asked to demystify it a bit, and I'm excited to be here and do this with you. I'm Marie. I'm a freelance composer and sound designer who has been working in games for the last 10 years, and I love to bring together all layers of audio. So I was often responsible for the audio experience as a whole, which means I worked on music, sound design, implementation, and even voiceovers and voice editing on most of the projects I was involved with. And I usually work with indie and mid-sized companies, so this is mostly tailored towards indie studios as well. And that's also what I'm doing as a senior audio designer at Sandbox Interactive, where we are working on Albion Online, which is an MMO, and I've been responsible for the audio in that game since 2017 as well. And normally you see me talk about more like design talks and about the audio decisions that were made from game design decisions, but earlier this year I gave a talk together with vocalist Julie Elvin at Reboot, and we touched on the topic of budgets and gave numbers, and then I was approached to make a talk specifically on that, and that's why I'm here for you today. So, what are the goals of this talk? I want to demystify the process of budgeting audio a bit and give you a better understanding of how the different audio departments work, and also explain different payment models and how they are priced, as well as like outsourcing to musicians and orchestras. And these learnings can also be transferred to working with freelancers in general. So if working with freelancers or outsourcing is something that is also a bit of a black box for you, I think this talk can also help you get a grasp on that as well. So the topics are that we will at first look at where you can start when you really have no idea with your project, like where to start with the audio budget, and since there are some rules that apply. And then we will look at the costs for an audio designer, which means sound design, music and implementation, and how you usually pay those folks if you outsource. And then lastly, we will look at hiring musicians or working with orchestras. What is not included, or not fully included, is voiceovers with voiceovers and directors and everything, because we don't have enough time to cover all of it properly, and this is a topic that actually deserves its own talk. So I will touch on it in some points, but I will not fully cover it. All right. Okay, where can you start with your budget? Audio budgets, just like any other department budget, are highly dependent on the project and type of project. But there is like a rule of thumb to go by, and that is that you should plan 10% of your budget for your audio needs. Sometimes 5% might be enough if your game is not really heavy on the audio end, but sometimes it's more like 15%, especially if you're developing a game that has a music focus, like rhythm action games where music is part of the main mechanic. As well as if you know your game will be fully voiced, you will probably also be more on the 15% end rather than 10%. But that's a good value to start with if you're still figuring it all out. Just to make sure, if your game has an overall budget of 500,000 euro, your audio budget should be 50,000 euro. And I'm saying that because a lot of teams just come up with a random 12,000 or 15,000 for like 10 hours of playtime, and that's usually something that will not work at the end of the day. So that's how it usually should work. Okay, let's say you plan 10% of your budget for audio, then let's look at how this is distributed between the different audio departments. As I mentioned already, I'm usually hired to do all of it, like music, sound design, implementation, consulting, testing, and mixing, and everything. And I'm time tracking everything I do because I like to have data. Because if I consult someone, I have to have data to actually back up what I'm saying, right? And when I time track, there's something, I can sort of draw conclusions from the projects that I worked on. And I noticed that this is sort of a rough generalization, but it's about like you can take the budget and split it in thirds almost like most of the time. Sometimes it's more music heavy, sometimes it's more sound design heavy, but usually it is around those numbers that a third of your budget should be allocated for sound design, which means creating all the sounds and ambiences. A third should be allocated for music and creating and producing all the music, and a third for implementing it, mixing it, testing it when you implement it, but also for meetings and communication, because meetings and communication is something that is often overlooked, and if you're part of the team, you have to communicate, so I would count that into the implementation part as well. Dialogue, in this case, as I said, is left out, as it is highly dependent on the kind of voiceover that you're going for, and also if you're going for renowned actors, or if you're, what kind of thing you're planning for. But an additional, if you have a fully voiced game, it will probably cut into thirds, fourths at this point. But when you have an overview of what you need, and you think your plan makes sense, I would give you the tip to add another 30% or like 20 to 30% buffer on top for oversights and for adaptability to changes. Because when you're very early in the project, there will be changes to game design later that affect audio, and you need a bit of buffer to actually cover for that changes. And if you don't plan any buffer, then you have to make compromises later on several levels, like buying sound libraries that maybe don't fit the style of the game you're making, or maybe just having one piece of music where you wanted several. So and in that pie chart, orchestra recordings and dialogue recordings, as I mentioned, are not already included. That would be an additional thing. All right. If you thought you can just lean back and listen in this talk, you're right, but I want to start with a little challenge for each of you, because I want you to put your estimation skills to the test. And don't worry, you don't have to say out loud what you estimate, it's just for you. But I want you to write it down or remember it, just to check how close you were to reality, because we will be talking numbers in this talk, and I want you to, I don't know, test yourself a little bit. So, the game I want to use as an example is a mobile game called GeoGods. And GeoGods was developed by a solo developer. It's a meditative solo card game where you take cards with gods on it and you place them on a board. And depending on the element they have interactions with crystals, and you can make points. So the goal is to make as many points as you can. So it looks like this. And this was also the state that I got when I was hired for the project. And so the needs for the projects were like this. He didn't say how many minutes of music he needs. It was just an estimation by me that it will probably be around 4 to 7 minutes. So let's just say around 5 minutes. That the game will need music for the in-game loop. It will need some music for the menu, and it needs some music for the result screen at the end. And SFX-wise, there were 56. 65, it's the other way around in German, I'm sorry. There were 65 sound effects listed in the first list, but to me it was clear that some of them would need variations, and at the end of the day we had like 92 SFX, including the variations. If you count the variations differently, it would still be 65. So those were 33 sounds for UI interactions and the cards, 55 for the magical things, like placing a god and the god leveling up and things like that, and the crystals, and 4 jingles. And jingle means like a more musical element for example, if the whole board is filled, there's a reward sound, and if you finish a game successfully, there's a more melodic element. And I split those separately because each of those have a different kind of complexity, so you would probably want to estimate differently for each category. Because a jingle obviously takes more time than a simple card interaction sound. Implementation-wise, we used Fmod in this case, which is similar to Wise, a middleware tool, and the events were already prepared by the dev. I'm saying that because that makes implementation easier for me if middleware is used. So, if that dev was you, what would you have estimated what this audio would cost you? And keep that number in mind. I want to show you what the game actually sounds like at the end of the day, because when I got the job offer, I had an idea in my head of what it will sound like, and you probably don't have that if you're not doing audio all the time. So this is what it sounds. Okay, now keep your number in mind or write it down. We will get to that again. All right, so if your project has audio like that, you will definitely need an audio designer in your team. So this role can be split into several people, like a composer, sound designer, and a technical audio designer for implementation. But let's just assume you hire one person who does all of it, because that's quite typical for the indie scene to have audio generalists take care of everything. Then there are different payment models that you can go by within your contract to work with them. And those three models are bundle prices, per minute of music or per SFX rates, and hourly compensation rates that are done with day estimates usually. And we will now look at all of these three options and their advantages and downsides. But of course, you can also hire your audio person just like any other employee and like put them on a salary like you do with your game designers. And if you want to do that, I would recommend you check out the Game SoundCon industry survey, because they are also bringing up examples for rate expectations and stuff like that. I will be covering outsourcing and freelancing here, but this survey is in general also interesting to get some more numbers on how audio is budgeted and how audio works, and sadly how few women and non-binary people are still in audio. Before I am explaining each of those models, I want to talk a bit about cost estimation in general. Because all of those models can be broken down to day estimates. But the hourly rate is the only one where you actually build the time that you invested in the project. And bundle and minute rates or SFX rates have also estimate usually with a day rate, but on top there are percentages for risks and unknown factors added that the audio person has to guess before going into a contract, because it's unlikely that they can renegotiate later for more money if things go wrong, right? And that's also fair, because those are, if you settle for a price in advance, you have to basically also settle, like include all the risks that can happen later on. And risks can be things like unplanned design changes, scope creep is pretty common, and also miscommunication. Like they say they want X and it turns out they want Y, and you invested several days to create X instead of Y. Just to name a few of the risks that can come up. So since all of those are based on day rates, let's first talk about what a day actually means in audio. So what can be done in a day? Again, it depends on the complexity of the material, but we can break it down a little bit at least. So music-wise, a day can be between half a minute to 3 minutes of music. So we usually calculate with an average of 1 minute of finished and produced minute of music per day. And it also depends on style and complexity, and I will get to that in the next slide. Sound-wise, the average is between 10 to 60 sounds, and the amount also depends on the complexity, as I already said. There are days when you're just creating 6 very complicated and long sounds, and others where you do 120 simple ones. But on average, it will be around 10 to 60, or I like to calculate with 20, including some risks. And simple sounds are footsteps, and looking at GeoGods, the card interaction sounds would be considered simple sounds. And complex sounds are usually sequences that, oh, that was too far, I'm sorry. Complex sounds are usually sequences that have to fit animations, longer sounds, or musical jingles, or like magical spells that have, where like there's an extensive animation and VFX sequence and you have to actually hit all the important moments. That's what I would consider complex, and that takes a bit longer. And the crystal interaction sounds in GeoGods and the musical jingles were on the more complex end when we go back to that example. Implementation-wise, it really depends on what needs to be implemented, but I like to calculate with, when I create something, it usually takes 1/3 of the creation time to actually implement it, just roughly. That's not always an accurate assessment, but like as a rule of thumb, that usually it's somewhere in that direction. Okay, so I just said the amount of music that can be done also depends on the style, and I want to explain that a bit more. So let's listen to some more music for a second. Is it playing? Yes, it's playing. So the choice of musical style is highly project-specific and should not be determined by budget, obviously, but you should be aware that style does affect the price. And most of the time you can say the more complex the music and the instruments and tracks, like the more tracks you have, the more time-consuming it usually is to produce it well. And that means, it also will cost more if it takes more time, right? An exception here is like very minimal music or like stuff like Billie Eilish's writing, because that's also very hard to do because it's so reduced. But otherwise, those rule generally applies. And what you just heard, I would categorize as more slow, textural, electronic ambience music. That is usually something that is easier to do and faster to do than, for example, writing a full orchestral score that we will hear in a second. So, but I want to mention that if you also go for music that has acoustic instruments, the need to sound as realistic as possible is big, so that means you probably also want to have those instruments recorded. And we're coming to musician prizes later on, but I just wanted to bring that out there. So, yeah, ideally, from the example that you just heard, that was all produced digitally, but if there would have been more budget, we would obviously have recorded the saxophone, but it wasn't possible in that case because the game was shelved. So here's an example of a digitally produced orchestral piece that is a bit more expensive since it has to sound as realistic as possible and it is making use of a full orchestra and also choir. So let's listen to that for a second. Okay, now that we know more about what can be done in a day, let's take a closer look at our 3 payment models that I brought up earlier. So let's start with the one that most people think of first, I would say, and that is the per minute of music rate. And that means people usually say, hey, we want 10 minutes of music, how much is that? And usually the price for that without a full buyout is between 800 to 1,200 euro, and like for the finished minute of music that you can implement. But it also depends on style and adaptivity needs. And some composers also may have a higher rate, especially if they are famous and established. But this is sort of the rates that I'm talking about are for senior people in Europe, or like Germany is where I am usually working, but maybe there are some differences in other countries depending on how expensive the country is, but that's just an average. This price does not include a full buyout. If you want a full buyout, it's probably around twice as much and would probably start around 1,500 to 3,000. But it's actually, for indie games, it's at this point usual that the composers retain the rights. You don't need a full buyout to have a cool soundtrack for your game. It's just, AAA studios often still want to do that, but for indie games it's not usual at this moment anymore. This fee also usually does not include live musicians or orchestral recordings. Sometimes the composers can play certain instruments and then they will include that. And if the composer is a singer, then good job, then that will also probably be included, but it depends. And sometimes they also renegotiate for that. But you also need to think about adaptivity when you actually calculate with that, because there needs to be some flexibility, especially when you're figuring out your musical needs very early in the project. And for example, if the music needs certain layers is something that some people will give at a discounted rate, but you have to write the music differently for it to have layers that can stand alone. So it's kind of a different approach. And if you just have a fixed per minute of music rate, that might get complicated. And you will also need, if you write for a complex adaptive system, you also have to think about all the transition pieces that make it work and flow. So those have to have a certain time amount allocated as well. Implementation is also often not included in that fee and will either be included if the price is higher or added as an additional hourly cost. And again, as I said, implementation, if it's 1/3 of the creation time, that also applies here. So the amount of minutes of music you need is something that in my experience, changes during the project, because when you create the project, the estimations about how long you will be in an area usually is not fixed yet, and if you change it later on and you don't have any money for left for your music budget, that can turn into a problem. So while this concept looks very straightforward and easy to calculate, I think there's still lots to discuss and to consider, so be aware of that. The sound equivalent of the minute of music rate is the per SFX rate, and when people calculate with that, they usually price something between 20 to 100 euro per sound. I've heard 50, I've heard 80, and sometimes it can go up to 300 if it's like a jingle, like a 15-second musical stinger at a situation obviously takes longer than making a footstep sound, so the prices can differ. And again, it's dependent on the complexity of the sound that needs to be included. So sound design, in contrast to music, is usually a full buyout, because sounds don't have their own life outside of games as much as music has, so that's already in there. And workflow-wise, this price usually means the people will record sounds on their own or use their own libraries or bought libraries and craft something out of that. If you expect to have specific recordings of big events, for example, you have historic cars in your game, and you expect the sound person to go and record those historic sounds, that's an entire different bucket of budget you have to open up to make that work. Let's look at, remember the game that you estimated? Let's look at what I would have cost if I would have negotiated the per sound and minute of music rate. I have to add that I usually don't do that, because I don't like having to foresee risks and calculate it on top, but let's just do that as a thought experiment for you. So let's just say I would have had a minute of music rate of 800 euro per music, because I would have given a discount since it was a solo dev and it was meditative and calm music, which is usually more on the easy end for me. Let's say I would have gone for 800. So we would have had 4,000 euro for 5 minutes of music. We didn't have any instrument recordings, just the digitally produced music, so there's no extra cost there. And the adaptability is already included since it was meditative and rather simple. It's just those 3 modes. Transitions were done very, very quickly, but yeah, it's a simple mobile game in this case. Okay, for the games, we said it's about 65 sounds. I just calculated with 70. Some of them needed variations. Complexity is medium. Some of them are jingles. I would have started with 50 euro per sound, I think, like all over the board, and then added 30% for variations that we have forgotten and other oversights and risks, because I didn't know the dev when he approached me. So there's a risk that there are entire parts of the game that he didn't really have on his mind when he pitched it to me. So usually people forget stuff. That's just what I'm saying, and you have to keep that in mind. So I would have planned 30%. Oh, that was close. Ooh, sorry, almost kicked over the water. Yes. So I didn't know how easy the implementation would be, so I would have added 2 days or roughly 2 days of implementation, meetings, testing, and everything, because there was a possibility that when we set the project up, we will run into issues, or that the dev is a person who likes to talk a lot, and then a meeting that should need 10 minutes suddenly needs 2 hours. So I had to sort of have that in mind as well, right? It's just work time for me. So I would have planned 1,000 for implementation, testing, and everything. So the total cost would have been 9,500 euro for that. Let's go to the next payment model. The second way to collaborate is just with the hourly rate, and that is actually my favorite way, because it has, in my opinion, the most advantages for both sides. If you hire someone with an hourly fee, the day rate for 8 hours of work, with senior experience is usually between 400 to 700 euro per day. And I'm also in the middle of that range. And if planning with that day rate without knowing how much days you're actually booking feels too open and risky for you, you always have the option to still set a budget limit within your contract, like a freelance contract with a budget limit. And I have that in most of my contracts as well. And yeah, it's more like a freelance contract rather than a work order in this case. And that mostly means the team and I agree to commit to a certain amount of time that I will invest each month or for a certain period of time. And then we always check back and forth what I should prioritize now. And yeah, so day rates are quite usual for sound design and implementation. They are not so much for music, but there are more and more audio generalists like me who actually just calculate with the day rate no matter if it's sound or music, because for me at the end of the day it doesn't matter as long as it elevates the game, right? So yeah, just as a reminder what we said before, 1 day means half a minute to 3 minutes of music or 10 to 60 sounds. So the advantages of that concept are that if you're paid hourly, you're part of the team, right? You're basically similar to a salary. You're like it's more on eye level, so that means it's more possible to share ideas and improve the process, because you also want things to be fast and to make progress fast, right? Also, the team gets exact data on how long each task you do takes, and they can use that data in the future for other projects to estimate their other projects and also learn where they can cut costs or where they actually need to plan more money because they underestimated how much work it is. And it also helps to have a transparent communication and a transparent planning with no black boxing. And I'm saying that because I've heard a lot of people think of audio as a black box where they don't really know how long stuff takes. And just working with an hourly rate and like having a list of that actually helps to get a better understanding. And I love being understood by my teammates, so maybe that's why I like that concept so much. Another advantage I see is if we get along well and there are no revisions because we're like hitting it off, you actually save money and I have more time off, so it can help actually help you avoid overworking as well. And it also means if I cannot work on one task because the team is blocking it, I can just jump to another one because all those approval meetings matter less if I'm just paid hourly. I don't have to have an approval for a payment to be approved, right? So that's kind of a bit easier to do. And yeah, similar to the as with the SFX rate, musicians and additional recordings obviously are added on top of that. So let's look at what GeoGuards would have cost if I would have been paid an hourly wage. How long did I actually need to do that thing? Again, these were the numbers that we're talking about. Let's just say I would have gone for a day rate of 500 euro. I would usually plan 1 to 2 days per minute of music. Sometimes it can be faster, but in this case, I was super fast because Arnold, the dev, was basically happy with everything I did, and I was very inspired. I don't know, maybe because it was this kind of yoga music that is kind of very relaxing to write, so it went very smooth. So that means I just needed 18 hours to compose and produce the 5 minutes of music, which is like 2 minutes of music per day. That's quite fast. The SFX were also quite fast. They were finished in 3.25 days. We just had some small revisions. We just had some cases where we needed more variations. But all in all, that is around 2,100 euro. And that means I created about 30 sounds per day, which is fast considering it's magical sounds. But if you calculate the variations out, it's a bit less. But that means he would have gotten the sounds for 23 euro per sound, which is like on the very low end for a SFX rate that I would have never gotten so low. And implementation and testing also went extremely fast and smooth. He always reacted immediately when I had any issues. He prepared everything I needed. I think we just spent all in all 1 hour in meetings in total because there was not so much to talk about. And testing and polishing was also very easy because there were no game-breaking bugs anymore. That's also something where you usually waste some time. So that was just all in all 8 hours, 500 euro. So the total time was 60 hours, and the total cost for that project would have been 3,750 euro, sorry. And yeah, as you've seen with the fixed rate before, I would have never gone so low because I could not have been calculating that everything goes as smoothly as it actually went. That would have been stupid. So yeah, and what you can also see in that data is that the time investment was not split in thirds, as I said before. But why is that? This game had very easy music needs and a lot of sounds that were like magical sounds that are important for the gameplay feedback. So it's more of an SFX-heavy game rather than a music-heavy game. All right, the last but not least, the bundle price. In the bundle price, the devs and the audio designer agree on a price for a certain set of needs or for the full project. That's also quite typical for indies. And of course, I cannot give you a fixed number for that. Hopefully it's 10% of the overall budget, but yeah, I don't know. But when we calculate bundle prices, we also usually use a day rate, and then we add all the risks on top. It's similar to the per minute of music or per sound effect rate, but I wanted to mention it as well because this concept has the advantage that the budget and the price are clear from the beginning, but there are some downsides that I want to talk about. And the first one is that you need a clear list of what is needed at the beginning of the project and who actually has that. That's not realistic. And it's unrealistic that this is actually ready and set in stone in the beginning. So that means it can either be bad for the audio person or bad for the production. It depends. Like if the audio person just says, okay, I'm okay with that there are 200 sounds added that I wasn't asked for in the beginning, I will just do it. The audio person will actually get a lower hourly rate than they negotiated or thought they negotiated. On the other hand, if they ask for more money mid-production and there is no more money, it becomes a problem for the production. So in addition to that, sorry, I should have clicked earlier. If it's a huge project and you actually want the composer or sound designer all for yourself and they cannot take on any other project, within a time span of a few years is also something that needs to be reflected in the budget by a higher budget that actually pays them the money they need to survive in that time, right? And also it's typical if you have a bundle price that a certain amount of money is paid in the beginning. It can be the full budget, it can be a third or half, but that should be put in at the very beginning as well. This pricing is still very common with indies, but as I said, I want to point out some of the risks. Because I've had regrets doing that, and I've heard from my dev friends that they had regrets as well, so I don't want to let that stand without mentioning them. So if the game design or scope changes, as I said, the freelancer might ask for money mid-production. Is one thing that is a problem when there's a scope change or design change. And the other thing is that if the devs are actually unhappy with the audio person, be it the quality or the speed of the deliveries because the person is unreliable, but they already spent half of their audio budget on the start of the project, they are way less likely to switch people and actually get someone who's invested into the project. And I've had friends who actually had that problem. They were obviously not working with me, but so it is a thing that can happen, and you need to be aware of actually when you commit to a bundle price that you're committing to a relationship that may be not working out through the entire time. And then there's the sunken cost, and that's just not a good position to be in. The risks for the audio people should be, either they just take it or they use that to actually add onto the price they are making with their bundle price. Because if you work with an inexperienced team, I can with a 100% certainty tell you the timelines will change. They will not be able to estimate the timelines realistically, so there will be stuff not working out. And you have to handle that. It depends, but it's a challenge, so maybe add that as a risk percentage on the bundle price. Another risk is unclear communication. As I already said, if they say they want X and it turns out they want Y, you have more revisions that are not your fault, but who's paying for them? Difficult. And also project changes are usually not calculated in when you talk with a bundle price. So so the list of risks for audio people is very long. There was actually a talk about that on Airwiggles by Nathan Moody, I think. If you're an audio person interested in that, I can recommend listening to that as well. And he also said if every risk that you should be aware of risks in general, like inexperienced people often are not. I also made a lot of mistakes when I started, but they should always add a certain percentage of cost on top if you're negotiating a bundle price, because he thinks that money can make it go away when you have problems. I'm more like, if there are too many red flags, maybe you walk away, but each to their own. So, all right, if I would have gone for a bundle price for GeoGods, what would I have estimated? I think I would have looked at the music and thought, I probably need 7 days of music for those 5 minutes, because as I said, meditative, I will be faster than 1 minute a day. Let's just say 7 days, 3,500 euros. I would have roughly said, okay, probably 6 days for all of the sounds, which is 3,000 euro. And then 1 day for implementing, testing, meetings, project setup, and everything. If I just estimate what I think I need, and then I would have added, as with the other concept, 30% for things to go wrong, revisions, things that we have forgotten in the beginning. And this I would have added also because I didn't know the dev before. If you've worked with them before, some of those risks may not apply, but I would have just like roughly added 30% for all the unknown factors because I didn't know that person and the process. Yeah, so I didn't know how easy it would be, and that would be another 2,000 on top as a risk buffer. Additional risks could have been that the project changes a lot, but since the project was already finished when I joined, there was no further risk of delays or anything or scope changes. Also, the team was just one person, so the risks that there's miscommunication was also pretty small, because there are not lots of people who can disagree on things, right? So yeah, the total cost here would have been 9,000 euro in that case. Similar to the SFX and per minute of music rate, it's just broken down differently. If you have a budget that is actually too small and you realize that now, there are some options that you can take to actually supplement it. And usually those are some kind of participation in sales once the game is out. And the most typical concepts for that are one, escalators, which means this is a fixed additional payment when the game hits a certain sales number. I've heard that from friends that the game was so successful that they got an additional amount of money once it hit a certain number, and that is also something you can do when your budget is quite small and you want to make it more attractive, or like you know that and you still want to have the people in the team. And another option is revenue share. But since these payments will only happen if the game comes out and also is successful, this is a huge risk for the audio person because they will not be responsible for whether it comes out and whether it's successful. It's not, audio doesn't usually not make or break that, right? So this is not a very attractive concept, and I would recommend you to only take those options when it is in addition to a low budget, but it should not be a replacement for a payment in general. And in case of GeoGods, I actually got an initial payment for about a week of work, and then I get 10% participation in sales after the game came out. So I now can write voices every month for the participation in sales, which is also nice. And in this case, as you've seen before, how long I needed to make that audio happen, that was actually a good deal for me, because everything went smooth and fast. So I already got most of the money back that I actually invested time-wise. Yeah, and for the dev, it was still fair because we're still below that number, so I was still taking a risk. But I normally don't do those things, but in this case, I was like, yeah, what if it goes smooth and fast? Let's just see what happens. And I would like that it is a non-violent game with those meditative aspects. And yeah, but you've seen my bundle estimates. With all the risks that could have been, those would have been way higher. Okay, so that was the big chunk about the sort of in-house audio people, or like the audio designers. Now let's look at what musicians and orchestras actually cost if you want to include those as well. So if there are exposed solo acoustic instruments in your music, it always makes a huge difference to record them. And this can be a good way to add quality on a budget. So this counts for any kind of instrument, but the greatest example here is with vocals. And I had, as I said, I had a talk together with Julie Elvin earlier this year at Reboot, and she allowed me to use her examples for this part, so be ready for some ear candy. The track she selected is from the indie game Candria that was released last year. The music was composed by Michael Dale, and they had the vocals layouted with a virtual instrument first for demonstration purposes, and the strings were already, like everything was digitally produced except for the strings. Those were already recorded. Let's listen to what that sounded like. Then Julie joined and sang in a fantasy language that was a mix of Japanese, Basque, and Irish influences, and she recorded her voice remotely in her studio in Munich. And yeah, even though it's an indie game, you can suddenly sound like a AAA production. Let's hear that.
네가 기어요 심에 미요사 스투리 아이 에다키세 에다키 눈에
that voice sounds familiar and you've been here for the Horizon talk in the very beginning, the voice you were hearing in the background when the, I forgot, long neck, tall neck thing came out of the earth, that was actually also her voice. Yeah, so what do you have to invest to make something like that happen? So for hiring musicians, there are usually two payment models, also either an hourly rate or a payment per track. And the hourly rate for solo instrumentalists is usually between, like instrumentalists, not voices, it's usually between 100 to 150 euro per hour. There might be a discount if you book a full day, but some people have a different pricing though, especially if they're famous, or if they're instrumentalists who need to book a studio to record their stuff. For example, percussionists with drums and everything usually have a higher price because they have to book a place where they can record, because their instrument is just super loud. You cannot do that at home, right? So in those cases, a per track fee also makes more sense for them. And what can be done within an hour depends on the preparation of the material and the complexity, but usually if you have just 1 to 2 tracks and there's a melody that needs to be recorded, that's usually doable in an hour. But if you have an orchestra score and you want a violin to play all the string sections once to make it more realistic, that's a different story, right? And Julie told me that in contrast to the audio designer who's been involved for months where an hourly fee seems more fair, for session musicians it's usually like that they prefer a per track fee, and since that is more feasible, especially for vocalists. So most session musicians, especially vocalists like Julie, charge on a sliding scale depending on the type, budget and size of the project. So if they work for an indie game where they know the budget is low, they will have the scale more on the left end, and if they work with a AAA studio that has a lot of money, there's a different price they will ask for. And this goes especially for vocalists like Julie because they will be connected very closely to the project and also contacted by fans about the scenes that are happening. And it's also a factor whether the instrumentalist is co-writing, like whether they have to come up with melodies as well, or if they're just playing what they're hearing. And yeah, in case of vocalists, the range, according to Julie, is between 300 and 3,000 euro per track. And the revisions are usually included in that price. So if solo voices are not enough, and you have an orchestra score, you probably hope to have it recorded with an orchestra, or at least with some sections of an orchestra. So let's look at what that cost entails and what options you have. I know I'm a bit late, but it's just a minute and then I'm done. So orchestras are usually booked per session, and one session is usually 3 to 3.5 hours long. And in those 3 hours, you can get up to 15 minutes of material recorded, like 15 minutes of music. It depends on the complexity again, and if you need passes with separate instruments groups, or if you just want to record the whole orchestra at once. And if you have simple material and just record the whole orchestra at once, you can get up to 20 minutes done. But if you want to split it in all the different sections, for example, brass separated from the strings, it's probably more like 5 minutes you will get done in a session. And the price of such a session is dependent on the orchestra, the country, and the size of the orchestra. And it typically starts around 6,000 euro for a session up to 60,000, where 60,000 is like renowned Abbey Road studios, for example. And yeah, the price here usually includes a conductor, engineer, like the whole team in the recording studio, including studio rent and contractors, Pro Tools operators, everyone. But what is not included is usually the mix. So that has to be booked in addition or done by the composer. And the rate here also is around 500 to 700 euros per day, and you can get several minutes of music mixed in a day. And yeah, choirs are also not included in a standard orchestra. So if you want a choir, there's additional costs onto that, because a choir usually has a lot of people. Last but not least, if you want to elevate your orchestral score, but hiring an entire orchestra is breaking the bank, there's also the possibility to just record a section, and which means just an instrument group instead of a full ensemble. And that is very common actually to do, to just book a string ensemble instead of a full orchestra, which just means string players. And that gives you like the organic and human feel, but also intimate feel to the music, but you still have the fatness of the digital production. And they, for example, also did that on the Horizon series that we heard earlier. And you could also just record main material and mix and blend with digital production. That's what they, for example, did on Zelda Skyward Sword. And we also do that in Albion due to the strict timelines that we have. And on the very tightest budget, the last thing you can do is have your soloist, just book one musician and have the soloist play some of the ensemble lines to breathe some actually humanness into your virtual orchestra. That way it sounds big and orchestral, but it's still organic. And yeah, that's a budget-friendly option. Sorry for speeding through at the end. I was not expecting to talk longer than 30 minutes. But yeah, I hope that breaking down those numbers gives you a better idea on budgeting your musical and sound design needs. We don't have time for questions, I'm sorry, but you can find me on the internet. And also greetings from and to Julie, who allowed me to use her material as well and her tracks. Make sure to check her out as well, she's amazing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately no time for questions, so we'll see you about 5 minutes for the next talk.